Hello everybody listening to futureprimitive.org. I am finally back here in the studio with my companion and creative friend John Lash, and we are bringing you a new series of talks, a series of 5 talks that we are calling Rapture and Revolution. Discussion on Entheogens and the Planetary Shift. This is a new series, and in this series we are going to talk about some very controversial terms. For instance, ecstasy. Ecstasy is a word that has been co-opted by many people, and we will talk about how we feel and what we think of ecstasy. The next word is rapture, and of course rapture is an extremely co-opted word as well. I won't go deeper into it, but I know that this will tickle you. And then of course there's the word entheogen, which is the word that has kind of replaced the word psychedelic. And then this wonderful question, which is planetary shift. Recently I had the great pleasure of interviewing Ralph Metzner, and he spoke about his first entheogenic experiences, and I see that a lot of people have listened to that, and so this is somewhat why John and I want to go deep into this subject together for your entertainment. So the first question I will ask John is, I will ask him about the Wasson thesis. What is it? What is the Wasson thesis?
Well, the Wasson thesis is the subject of this first talk in this new series Joanna and I are doing, and so we're titling the first talk The Wasson Thesis and the Religious View of Nature. And in order to describe what the Wasson thesis is, we really need to clarify these terms that Joanna has specified. So my wish would be, as these discussions proceed, that we can frame them in a very clear way for you. And not that we are presenting the be-all and the end-all definition of these terms, because that's not our goal. We're certainly not coming from an authoritative posture here. But it always helps to elucidate and clarify certain key terms in a discussion. And this is especially true when those terms have been co-opted, as Joanna says. The term ecstasy has been co-opted by the rave scene. It refers to MDMA, a popular drug. Can we go back to a more primordial and original meaning of ecstasy? This is what we want to do. The word rapture has been co-opted by the fundamentalist religion. Many devout Christians who take the Bible literally are waiting for the rapture to occur, which is the moment when they would be lifted off the earth by the Savior God. Rapture is such a beautiful word, and any of you out there who've ever experienced a moment of rapture know that it's a beautiful experience as well, to be in rapture. So we'd like to claim back this term and give it back to you in a new way, in a refreshed way, free of some of its connotations. And also, as we go along, we'd like to clear up, or at least present from our understanding, a clarification of entheogens and the planetary shift. The Wasson thesis is the perfect subject that unites all of these terms. So let me explain just briefly what it is, define it, and then Joanna and I will proceed to discuss that definition. The Wasson thesis is so named because it originates with an individual named R. Gordon Wasson, who was born at the end of the 19th century, 1895 I think, and died in 1986. And R. Gordon Wasson was actually a banker, a financier, who worked for J.P. Morgan in New York, and yet he was also an extraordinary individual, a dilettante, a scholar, a linguist, a comparative mythologist, and other things. R. Gordon Wasson is considered today to be the founder of the field of studies called ethnomycology. Ethnomycology is related to ethnobotany. These are just big words which refer to the study of the role of plants, especially psychoactive plants and psychoactive mushrooms, in human culture, in history, and particularly in religion. So the Wasson thesis is therefore simply the thesis formulated by R. Gordon Wasson. But I would point out, and I consider this to be a particularly tender point and a crucial point, is that it was not the product of the great mind of R. Gordon Wasson, who was a man. In fact, the Wasson thesis on the origin of religion was the product of two minds, his mind and that of his Russian wife, Valentina Wasson, whom he met in London when he was in his 20s. And Gordon and Valentina actually worked together for many years, and it is from the marriage of their minds that this thesis was born. So I'd like to point that out because I consider that to be a remarkable fact. So what is the Wasson thesis? Well, I'll give it to you in one phrase. It states that the original religious experience of humanity was a visionary trance induced by the ingestion of psychoactive plants. That is the Wasson thesis. It is a thesis or theory, if you will, a proposal, a proposition regarding the origin of religion. And in that sense, it is an extremely profound theory, because religion is obviously a matter of deep importance to our species. And even though religion can be viewed in a very negative light, I believe it's necessary for us to look at the possibility of a primordial religious experience for our species. I believe it's important. The Wasson thesis is important for a whole range of reasons, which we're going to discuss here as we go through the various topics. Just for starters, the Wasson thesis is important because it has something to say to us about the primary religious experience of our species, not about religion, not about dogma, institutions, hierarchy, but about, we can throw all that away if you want to. We can say, discard all that. Suppose we don't want to be involved in hierarchy, dogmas, and belief systems. There is still an essential religious capacity in humanity, and the Wasson thesis addresses what that capacity is.
So how is it that these two individuals, Gordon Wasson and Valentina Wasson, who were, in my talk, extremely straight people? I mean, in fact, he was a banker. You said that. How is it that these extremely straight people, I can remember from reading a book that she was very interested in mushrooms in general, and he was kind of phobic about mushrooms. So how is it that within the research of edible mushrooms, I'm sure this is how it started for her, edible mushrooms, and in fact mushrooms are delicious, these very straight people get to researching the primordial religious experience?
Well, it's a fascinating question you raised, Joanna. One of the things that I like about the Wasson thesis is that it does have a story attached to it. We can discuss the thesis in itself and debate it and so forth and so on. But to me, it's equally important to know how this story, how this thesis arose, and about the story of the Wassons and who they were. They were extremely straight people. And it seems, I've been familiar with this story now for quite a while, as you know, and we discuss it a lot. I discuss it with people on many occasions when I can. It never ceases to amaze me that perhaps the most controversial and taboo notion of our time, of the last 50 years, came from these two extremely straight people, you know, and one wonders how. Well, I'll just give you a little anecdote, which is practically legendary among the people who know about Wasson and his work. And this is the story of gathering mushrooms in the Catskill Mountains on his honeymoon. So when Wasson married Valentina, they were a couple of young people in their mid-20s, I think, and they went for a honeymoon in the Catskills. This would have been around 1924, 25, something like that, after the First World War. And Valentina, who was Russian, was used to gathering mushrooms in the fields of all kinds, toadstools, mushrooms, all kinds of fungi, gathering them up and bringing them home, cooking them and eating them. And Gordon Wasson, who was a white, middle-class, liberal person from the East Coast of the United States, was what he called a mycophobe, or a mushroom-fearing person, whereas she was a mycophile, or a mushroom-loving person. So he was incredibly shocked when they took a walk in the Catskill Mountains during their honeymoon there, and came across the field with many different fungi growing, and she rapturously ran out into the field and started to gather them up into her dress and to bring them home and eat them, and he thought they would both be dead by the end of the day. And so their love, their romance, as it were, was what gave birth to this thesis. I think that's an important point. And what they proceeded to do from that point on was to discuss the question of, well, why are there mycophobic people and mycophilic people? Why are there people who are terrified even to the thought of touching a mushroom, and there are other people from different cultures who love mushrooms and eat many different varieties? And of course this brings up the subject of the poisonous mushrooms, and some mushrooms are poisonous, and since there are many varieties, if you're not able to distinguish the poisonous ones, you may want to shun mushrooms altogether. So that could explain the mycophobia. But no, the Wassons weren't satisfied with that explanation. They thought that the mycophobia might go much deeper into the human psyche, and that there might be some revelation or insight involved if they explored that mycophobia, fear of mushrooms. And so basically they just talked about it, they researched it, they were wealthy enough to have the leisure time to order the books and do the research, and they made it their personal project to investigate what role mushroom-loving and mushroom-hating behaviors might have had in human culture. And little by little, and I'm talking about a lifetime activity for these people, it led them to formulate sometime, probably during the Second World War, or shortly after, 20 years of conversations going on behind this, I have to tell you. Like Joanna and I have been discussing RNA and DNA for 20 years, reprogramming of DNA, they were discussing the role of mushrooms. And Wasson himself said toward the end of his life that he could not really claim to be the author of this theory. He didn't know whether it was he or Valentina who had first actually formulated it in words. But at some point in the course of their studies and their ongoing dialogue, they did formulate the theory in words. And there are various ways to spin the theory. There are various ways and aspects of it. The synopsis I just gave is probably the most rigorous way to state it. But another way to state it is this. They came to the conclusion, the Wassons came to the conclusion, after some 20 years of discussion and research, that religion, as we know it, probably originated from an ecstatic trance that was experienced by people in the Ural Mountains, somewhere in the depths of Russia or Asia, who ingested a powerful psychoactive mushroom in the Paleolithic age. So this is a more fleshing out more of the theory. They believe that in the Paleolithic age, that is before 15,000 BC, there was actually probably a mushroom cult among the people living at that time in the heartlands of Inner Asia or Russia. And from this mushroom cult originated the various types of religions that we understand today. So it's a big, big story and a big, big picture that they're presenting. And the best way to understand how this story evolved is to understand their relationship and their love and their commitment to this fantastic idea over many, many years.
So basically, this they would have come across this realization around the time that Albert Hofmann discovered LSD. What a coincidence. Would you care to comment on that?
Coincidence, synchronicity, call it what you will, it's a powerful fact. And I think it speaks, once again, it speaks of the extraordinary timing of 1947, 1943, when Hofmann discovered LSD, and then in 1947 and into the 50s, when the awareness of that substance came into the world. It was the same time that the Wasson thesis was emerging in the world. That's right.
So, listeners, put yourself back in a time where there was no war on drugs. There was no drug advocacy, there was no war on drugs, and I'm talking about a war on drugs that includes plants, the plants that grow from the earth. So let's go back to a time like that, and Wasson and Valentina realize that in some way the religious experience has been co-opted, but there was truly a natural and basic source of illumination that was non-addictive, that had no side effects, and that, of course, was not forbidden. What happened? What happened at that time?
Well, before I answer that question, which is, of course, the second part of the story about the taboo on the primary religious experience, I'd like to point out that how crucial it is to understand this discovery in the way that you just said. It's also crucial to bear in mind that they came to this conclusion without ever having taken mushrooms themselves, which is really pretty wild when you come to think of it. Actually, you know, up until about, for the first 20 years, a little more than 20 years of Wasson and Valentina's work, Wasson was more or less an armchair philosopher and an armchair scholar, like Sir James Fraser, who was a British mythologist whom he admired very greatly. Sir James Fraser wrote about anthropology, but he never left the library. And that was pretty much what Wasson and Gordon and Tina were doing up until the point where they got so curious about the idea that they said, well, let's start looking around to see if we can have this experience. And actually some clues came to them very fortuitously from various people, such as the British poet and mythologist Robert Graves, who wrote The White Goddess, sent them a clue. Other people that they contacted, such as Richard Schultes, who was the head of the botanical studies at Harvard University and became a close friend of the Wassons. Wasson was very good in attracting the kind of professional people that he needed to help him in this research. And what happened, and it's beautiful to follow the dramatic build-up of the story here, what happened is as they began to research this subject and as they became more and more convinced that there was a primary ecstatic religious experience given by sacred plants, well, they felt obviously compelled to have that experience themselves. And so a central part of the Wasson story concerns how that happened. Now, Joanna, well, we're talking about between around 1952 to 1962. Gordon Wasson was directed by a couple of clues he received to central Mexico, and he heard from a couple of researchers of the possibility of the survival of a ritual mushroom cult in central Mexico. And so between around 52 and 62, each year during the rainy season, which was when the mushrooms come out, Wasson used his personal resources, which were considerable. He could hire private planes and things like that, to go and explore the central mountains of Mexico. And that leads to the dramatic part of the story, of which Joanna has been very involved in the last couple of years, which is Gordon Wasson's meeting with Maria Sabina.
Yes, some of you might recall that 2 years ago I went to Mexico, and I went to Huautla de Jimenez, which is in the Mazatec Mountains, in a pilgrimage actually with the 13 indigenous international grandmothers. And we were received by Julieta Casimiro, Mama Julieta, who is actually the heir to Maria Sabina. Maria Sabina was the shaman, the woman shaman, who received the Wassons the first time they made the trek to Mexico to verify their experience, to verify their ideals actually at the time. And if I understand well, if I remember well, Wasson and Valentina, the first time they went to meet Maria Sabina in the Mazatec Mountains of Mexico, did not partake in the ceremonial use of the mushroom. They only became aware that yes, indeed, there was a mushroom ritual. And it's only the second time they went that they actually partook in the ingestion and the experience of the mushroom.
Well, they did make 10 journeys, and there are various details and somewhat various versions of what happened on each journey. But it is a known fact that in late June of 1952, Gordon Wasson received from Maria Sabina the magic mushroom. She handed them to him at the beginning of an all-night ritual. Yeah, they are taken in pairs, up to 13 at a time. She handed him a pair of blue-staining mushrooms, possibly Stravaria capensis or some closely related species that grows in that area. And I call that moment the moment of the handover. At that moment, Maria Sabina, this little Mazatec curandera, handed over to a New York banker the medium for the primary religious experience of which he had been contemplating and researching for over 20 years. Yeah, and the catalytic results of that meeting and that handover were immense. Now, I would point out two things to those of you who may not know the details of this story, and they are one thing is a fact, and the other is speculation based on that fact. The fact is that Gordon Wasson was a very interesting character, because not only was he very conventional, but he was in certain respects somewhat of a self-promotional person. And he actually went to Huautla to see Maria Sabina on several later occasions with a New York fashion photographer and with a contract from Life magazine to do an article for Life on his discovery of the mushroom cult in Mexico. And so in May of 1957, that's just a little over 50 years ago now, Life magazine brought out an issue that had as a main story, it was not the cover story, but it was indicated on the cover of Life magazine, the discovery of a secret mushroom cult in Mexico. And it was written by Gordon Wasson. It was illustrated by glossy color photographs by this photographer Alan Richardson, who also ingested the mushrooms. And that single article, okay, that's a fact that article was published. The speculation is, did that single article trigger the whole psychedelic revolution? Many people think so. Many people believe so. One thing we do know is that a great tide of pilgrims and hippies and rock stars and high fashion models and writers, and including Timothy Leary, including John Lennon, including Bob Dylan, thereafter flooded to Huautla in order to receive the mushroom sacrament from Maria Sabina. So there's no question that a cult was exploded, a cult event exploded out of this. And to a very large extent, that cult event, although not it was not the exclusive event, but to a very large extent it fed the psychedelic revolution of the 60s.
I just have to say at this moment, I have to go back and say, we are talking about a moment where this particular plant is not illegal. The psychedelic-entheogen experience is not illegal. Why is it? How is it? I mean, this is in Life magazine. How is it that very shortly after that, few years after that, it becomes one of the most dangerously illegal things in the world? Why? What is this?
The psychedelic revolution, which exploded in the United States in the 60s, was inspired to some degree by Wasson's work. It was equally inspired, though, I should point out, by Aldous Huxley, and who came with a different angle and a different approach, because several years before, 2 years I think it was, before the Wasson article appeared, Aldous Huxley published The Doors of Perception, which was his personal account of his illumination and his ecstatic religious experience using mescaline. And Huxley later went on to use LSD and to write about that as well. So there's, for those of you who don't know this story and are putting it together for the first time, it may be helpful to bear this in mind, that there was kind of a dual track. There was the Huxley mescaline LSD track, which relates back to Albert Hofmann, who discovered LSD in 1943, and then there was the Wasson mushroom track. And those two tracks cross each other at certain points, but they are independent tracks. The one person who was involved in both of those tracks was Albert Hofmann himself, because he was involved, he was the father of LSD, but he also became a close friend and collaborator with the Wassons, and went to Mexico with the Wassons and so forth. And synthesized psilocybin out of the sacred mushrooms. Yeah, for the Sandoz Laboratories, and made an absolute fortune for them in doing so. So this is a story of our time, and I personally, as a veteran of that generation, as someone who was 15 years old in 1960, I personally consider this to be probably the most important story of our time. The question Joanna's asking me of why psychedelics became illegal. I would also point out to you there are many details to this story, folks, and please excuse us for being a little hit and miss on this. We're not here to give you a cut and dried exposition, but there are many important details. For instance, you ought to know that before LSD was made illegal, when it became very popular as an underground drug, it had been extensively used in legal experiments in curing alcohol addiction, in treating psychotics, in treating schizophrenics. Its medical and the medical and therapeutic value of LSD had been extensively proven in clinical tests before it became known as an underground drug and subsequently banned. So that's one side of the story. The other side of the story is the Wassons were pointing to a history of our species going back thousands and thousands of years. And they were saying, look, whatever religion is today, whatever religion has become, it has become so not because it gives us a genuine experience of God, but precisely the opposite. Religion has become what it is because it denies us the ecstatic experience of direct awareness of divinity, direct awareness of the divine intelligence of the earth, and the rapture and the knowing that comes from that experience. And so, inevitably, the LSD, which is a chemical product of a laboratory, was forbidden, and inevitably the plant that Maria Sabina handed to Gordon Wasson was also forbidden. I just want to add an update on that today. I've been living in Europe for 16 years, and everyone who comes to Europe and is interested in not drugs, because I never talk about drugs, but who is interested in psychoactive plants, knows that you can go to Holland and you can buy hashish and marijuana and mushrooms. And until very recently, you could buy dried mushrooms in Holland in the so-called smart shops, and you could order them. Dried mushrooms were ruled illegal a couple of years ago, and currently, right now, they are ruling fresh mushrooms illegal. So we are looking at an ongoing campaign to forbid society from even knowing about what these substances are, and to forbid society from that primordial religious experience that was pointed out by the Wassons about 50 years ago.
So I would like to backtrack to Gordon Wasson, Aldous Huxley, and in my talk with Ralph Metzner, we spoke about Alan Watts and how Alan Watts had been Ralph's mentor twice in his life. So I think Alan Watts had an enormous influence on this flowering or this remembering of the primordial religious experience.
Alan Watts was tremendously important in that configuration that happened in the late 50s and early 60s. He was certainly immensely important to me because of his writings on Zen, which really turned me toward the path of illumination more than anything else I had encountered when I was in my teens. This is not ancient history we're talking about here. This is the story, a story of our time, and maybe the decisive story of our time. You know, Joanna and I have decided to call this series Rapture and Revolution, because as veterans of the 60s, we have a certain overview of what has happened since then and where we might be going with the entheogenic experience. Now, I've put that catchphrase out. Let me just describe for a moment what I mean by that. By the entheogenic experience, we understand the visionary trance and the ecstatic state induced by psychoactive plants. Okay? Now,
But we have not used them in over 20 years, haven't we? We haven't.
Yes, it probably would be necessary to make that qualification. I'm not sure why Joanna made that, but I'll just let that stand as it is. And I want to point out that the use of entheogenic plants is now largely forbidden. Okay, we're not going to go into the technicalities of the law, but in most states of the United States, I believe that psychoactive mushrooms are illegal. And as I said, even though they've been legal in Holland and in Europe for some years, they're now being illegalized here. The point that I want to make is that we are looking at a moment in history right now when some things are very, very grave on the planet. We've all woken up since 9/11. We've all become aware, many of us I should say, have become aware that the world is run on deceit and manipulation, that there are insane control freaks at every level where society is directed and managed. And many of us are wondering, is there anything we can do about this, you know? Is there any way we can change the system? Is there any way we can defeat these powers and revolutionize our society? Which, by the way, is the same question we were asking back in the 60s. What we want to point out in this series of talks is that there may be an intrinsic relation between our power to revolutionize our society and have a better world and defeat the forces of deceit and control and our access to this primary religious experience. Yes. That's why we're saying it's rapture and revolution. Now, we're not sure that that's actually the case. We're doing this series of talks, we're having this discussion to find out actually what we think about it and to share with you what we think and what we think might be possible.
So, I just want to ask you one more thing. what is the connection between many of us being severed from the nurturing powers of the earth and the illegality of the ingestion of plants produced by the earth?
Well, that question is extremely intriguing, I think, Joanna, because in order to answer that question, I would have to first make a careful distinction. This is just a distinction that I make, and those who are listening to this talk can take it or leave it. You may not like my distinction, you may prefer to make your own, but I do distinguish very strongly between psychoactive plants found in nature, such as a Stropharia cubensis mushroom, and cocaine and mephedrine and other drugs. So I consider that the war on drugs is kind of a big smokescreen for a much, much more crucial issue, you know. I am totally against cocaine. I am totally against heroin. I am totally against all the evil, addictive drugs that are big business on this planet and that destroy lives. I am not a drug advocate. I agree with what Terence McKenna said. The psychedelic message is an anti-drug message. What did he mean when he said that? I believe that what Terence meant was that the psychedelic message or entheogenic message is about the benefit that we have from the sacred plants, the psychoactive plants that nature provides for us. Okay? That's the subject that I want to talk about. I do not want to talk about either side of the drug war. That has nothing to do with the drug war. But the problem is that these things get very confounded, because what's happening today is, for instance, dried mushrooms in Europe are now considered a Class A, possession of them is considered a Class A drug felony equivalent to the possession of cocaine. So what has happened is that the authorities and the people who are fighting the drug war are also using that drug war as a pretext to forbid something that has nothing to do with drugs at all. Psychoactive mushrooms and Amanita muscaria and the sacred plants, the psychoactive plants of this planet, have nothing to do with drugs. They grow here, they are provided to our species by nature, they have been used for thousands of years in indigenous cultures, and by animals as well. And what I want to bring your attention to is the fact that we are not only being forbidden to use these drugs, but we are even forbidden to have the knowledge that they exist, and we are even forbidden to have the common sense to distinguish them from other drugs such as cocaine or hard drugs or Valium or Prozac, you know? And so the situation is truly insane. And I think if Gordon Wasson were here today, he would probably agree. He was not a taboo buster. He was not a defiant person. He was not someone like me who went out with the attempt to bring down religion and, uproot Christianity. He was not a heretic like I am, but I'm sure that he would agree today that we're facing an insane situation in which the primary gifts that nature affords to us for our illumination are being deprived by the authorities and by the people who control our society. So the logic behind all this, again, brings us back to the subject of this, the dual subject of this talk. If we are being forbidden these tools of illumination, might it not be these very tools of illumination that we need in order to revolutionize our society? I don't know. I'm just putting this question out, and we're going to look at it from various angles in the succeeding talks.
Yes, we are going to look at very critical questions like what is behind the adversary game, as we said in the beginning. Why is ecstasy, and I'm not talking about the drug ecstasy? Why is the feeling of ecstasy, the awareness of ecstasy, the most revolutionary feeling one can have? And what are the practical applications of feeling ecstasy, and what are the practical applications of being aware of the primordial religious experience?
I remember very clearly when I was living in New York in the 1960s, 65, 66, 67, what the LSD scene was like, at least my experience of it. And one of the things I remember most vividly was the experience of scoring acid. And I'll tell you, just to give you one example of what happened when I scored acid in the Lower East Side in 1965. Well, I heard about someone, through the grapevine who had some acid, and of course one always asked if it was good, and I heard that it was Sandoz. So back in those days you thought if you could get Sandoz that was really good, and it was $5 a hit. So I made the various connections, and I was told to go to a certain apartment off Tompkins Square or something like that, and I went there, and I went in, and there was, what you might imagine as the typical hippie scene of the time, with the Rolling Stones playing or whatever. And I met the young man who was selling me this $5 dose of Sandoz, and was a complete stranger to me, so there was always an element of trust in these transactions. But what I want to convey to you today, these 40 years later, was the way that transaction took place. It was not a commercial transaction. Not at all. I did give him $5 and he did give me a pill, but that was not the transaction. The transaction was that he put in my hand this pill, and he looked into my eyes, and he said to me, "May you see the clear light." And I looked into his eyes and I said, "And may we see the revolution." And that was how you copped LSD. And what that anecdote illustrates is that in our minds at that time, the illumination that came through this substance and the revolution and change that we were looking for in our world went hand in hand. They were inseparable. We really believed that by taking that and transforming our own minds, we could change the mind of the world, and we could make a better world, a fair and kinder, compassionate, playful place to live in. We really believed that it was a revolutionary political act to become illuminated on LSD.
And in fact, I want to announce that I have been writing about my first LSD experiences that occurred later in 1969, and we are going to be placing segments of this autobiographical writing on our sister site, metahistory.org. So please look out for these segments on my section in Metahistory called Precious Mind. We're going to bring this talk around now, but remember there will be 4 more. And I just want to ask John if he wants to say something in closing.
Well, it's been, what I'd like to say is that I am a deeply shy person. And I am particularly shy about the subject we're talking about here. Or maybe it's something more than shyness. Maybe it's also discretion. This is a sacred subject, and Joanna and I, although we discuss it continually between ourselves, are very careful about discussing it elsewhere. But I think this is the moment to do so. We're going to do our best to be clear with you and to be absolutely straight about this. And I just want to say that I think it's exciting to do this now, because I believe that the conviction that swept through our generation in the 60s is not dead. I believe that conviction still lives, and if it can be resurrected and re-engaged, there is no better time to do it than now, and I would love to see that happen in any way that it could happen.
And in closing, I'd like to say that I am that conviction.
Thesis was born. So I'd like to point that out because I consider that to be a remarkable fact. So what is the Wasson thesis? Well, I'll give it to you in one phrase. It states that the original religious experience of humanity was a visionary trance induced by the ingestion of psychoactive plants. That is the Wasson thesis. It is a thesis or theory, if you will, a proposal, a proposition regarding the origin of religion. And in that sense, it is an extremely profound theory, because religion is obviously a matter of deep importance to our species. And even though religion can be viewed in a very negative light, I believe it's necessary for us to look at the possibility of a primordial religious experience for our species. I believe it's important. The Wasson thesis is important for a whole range of reasons, which we're going to discuss here as we go through the various topics. Just for starters, the Wasson thesis is important because it has something to say to us about the primary religious experience of our species, not about religion, not about dogma, institutions, hierarchy, but about, we can throw all that away. 1895, I think, and died in 1986. And R. Gordon Wasson was actually a banker, a financier, who worked for J.P. Morgan in New York. And yet he was also an extraordinary individual, a dilettante, a scholar, a linguist, a comparative mythologist, and other things. R. Gordon Wasson is considered today to be the founder of the field of studies called ethnomycology. Ethnomycology is related to ethnobotany. These are just big words which refer to the study of the role of plants, especially psychoactive plants and psychoactive mushrooms, in human culture, in history, and particularly in religion. So the Wasson thesis is therefore simply the thesis formulated by R. Gordon Wasson. But I would point out, and I consider this to be a particularly tender point and a crucial point, is that it was not the product of the great mind of R. Gordon Wasson, who was a man. In fact, the Wasson thesis on the origin of religion was the product of two minds, his mind and that of his Russian wife, Valentina Wasson, whom he met in London when he was in his 20s. And Gordon and Valentina actually worked together for many years, and it is from the marriage of their minds that this, and this is especially true when those terms have been co-opted, as Joanna says. The term ecstasy has been co-opted by the rave scene. It refers to MDMA, a popular drug. Can we go back to a more primordial and original meaning of ecstasy? This is what we want to do. The word rapture has been co-opted by the fundamentalist religion. Many devout Christians who take the Bible literally are waiting for the rapture to occur, which is the moment when they would be lifted off the earth by the Savior God. Rapture is such a beautiful word, and any of you out there who've ever experienced a moment of rapture know that it's a beautiful experience as well, to be in rapture. So we'd like to claim back this term and give it back to you in a new way, in a refreshed way, free of some of its connotations. And also, as we go along, we'd like to clear up, or at least present from our understanding, a clarification of Entheogens and the Planetary Shift. The Wasson thesis is the perfect subject that unites all of these terms. So let me explain just briefly what it is, define it, and then Joanna and I will proceed to discuss that definition. The Wasson thesis is so named because it originates with an individual named R. Gordon Wasson, who was born at the end of the 19th century,
Hello everybody listening to futureprimitive.org. I am finally back here in the studio with my companion and creative friend John Lash, and we are bringing you a new series of talks, a series of 5 talks that we are calling Rapture and Revolution. Discussion on Entheogens and the Planetary Shift. This is a new series, and in this series we are going to talk about some very controversial terms. For instance, ecstasy. Ecstasy is a word that has been co-opted by many people, and we will talk about how we feel and what we think of ecstasy. The next word is rapture, and of course rapture is an extremely co-opted word as well. I won't go deeper into it, but I know that this will tickle you. And then of course there's the word entheogen, which is the word that has kind of replaced the word psychedelic. And then this wonderful question, which is planetary shift. Recently I had the great pleasure of interviewing Ralph Metzner, and he spoke about his first entheogenic experiences, and I see that a lot of people have listened to that, and so this is somewhat why John and I want to go deep into this subject together for your entertainment. So the first question I will ask John is, I will ask him about the Wasson thesis. What is it? What is the Wasson thesis?
Well, the Wasson thesis is the subject of this first talk in this new series Joanna and I are doing, and so we're titling the first talk, The Wasson Thesis and the Religious View of Nature. And in order to describe what the Wasson thesis is, we really need to clarify these terms that Joanna has specified. So my wish would be, as these discussions proceed, that we can frame them in a very clear way for you. And not that we are presenting the be-all and the end-all definition of these terms, because that's not our goal. We're certainly not coming from an authoritative posture here, but it always helps to elucidate and clarify certain key terms in a discussion,